So today we are excited to kick off our Meadows in the Making webinar series. So hopefully this will be the first of many on the topic of native meadows. And this can be, we're gonna hopefully have topics about where to start. One of the best places to start, you're here, you're learning from some experts in the field, and then join us for some more, and we'll talk about from how can you make a small yard meadow all the way up to talking with people who have done very large meadows. So we're throughout the year going to have multiple webinars talking all about native meadows. And I do want to make sure that everybody just has a general understanding of what we mean when we say native meadows, because this can be a term that means many different things. And so what we're in generally talking about is a free growing area. It's usually pretty low lying, that's mainly populated with the majority of native grasses and wildflowers, and mostly herbaceous plants. And so that's pretty much what we're going to mean when we say native meadows. Okay, so now that we have a little basis, I don't want to waste any more time. I want to jump right in to our wonderful speaker. We are so excited to have Maddie Bright joining us today. And Maddie is the executive director of Earth Sangha, where she's worked in native plant conservation since 2011. And Maddie is just phenomenal. We are so excited. I've heard her speak multiple times, and I just learn so much every single time from Maddie. And Maddie has worked closely with ecologists, botanists, park managers on all things plant conservation and around many different ecological restoration projects. And she regularly teaches multiple master naturalist chapters across Northern Virginia, and also is involved in multiple steering committees and mainly the National Capital Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, along with many, many other roles. And is highly involved in all things native species. So we are so excited to have Maddie joining us here, and we can't wait to hear what she has to share with us. So Maddie, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us here. Let me just jump ahead to the next slide. Is this working? No, it's not working for me. I'm sorry.
Yep.
There it goes. Did you do that or did I do that, Taylor?
You should have access.
Okay, great. So just a little bit about our work at the Earth Sangha. We're a small nonprofit based in Fairfax County, so right here in Northern Virginia. We do a lot of work throughout the region here, as well as into DC, the Maryland suburbs. But we're really focused on protecting our native plants that are local right here. So to that end, our biggest ongoing project is our wild plant nursery. This is a photo of our nursery there. We grow about 300-ish species or so, all from seed and spore that we collect with permission, primarily with Fairfax County Park Authority. To put that number in perspective, 300 species is about a quarter of all the vascular plants that are native to Fairfax County. So there are about 1,200 or so native plants right here in Fairfax County. So we've grown a tiny little slice of those. And every year we distribute somewhere in the realm of 55 to 65,000 plants. And a lot of those go out to public lands, to restoration projects, but we also supply to individuals too. Sorry, there's a little bit of a slowdown with there we go. So the reason that I really wanted to speak about meadow conservation in particular, I think that, there are a lot of topics that we can cover when it comes to restoring and protecting our natural areas, our plant communities. But I think that meadows, especially kind of, whether we're talking about dry land or, moist to mesic to even into wetland meadows and grasslands, we're talking about a kind of habitat that is, one, very, very important, but also really kind of under realized and undermanaged towards. So we have a relatively long period of recent history that has really favored forestry and forest management as the prevailing way of protecting our public lands. And this isn't to say that forests are not great, but we did historically have a whole lot more open space and meadows. And that's true even here east of the Appalachian Mountains. that we used to have bison and things like that. And at the tail end of the talk, I'll talk a little bit about the historical context. But definitely in our urban and suburban areas, but even as we get out into more rural spaces, we're missing a lot of opportunities for conservation of our meadow species. So some of that is with those ecotones. So that is a transition from one habitat type to another. So a very common ecotone that we see is a transition from a full sun grassy area, some kind of meadow or prairie system, into a forested system. And a healthy ecotone would be wide, it would be broad, it would be diverse, it would not be filled with invasive species. And that's not typically what we see on most of our ecotones. And that's true of farmland and that's true of our cities too. Our meadows are really crucial to a lot of wildlife use, and there are a lot of specialists that have to be in our meadows, and that's birds that may need dozens to more than 100 acres to nest in our grasslands. It can also be things as small as ground nesting bees that need access to open and bare soil in sunny areas to be able to create a little colony. So we're talking about a lot of different things that have complex needs that are only met in this kind of habitat. And the other reason I really love doing this kind of work, especially as we talk about our open areas, our meadows, our prairies, is that there is a lot to be said about creating sort of meadow analogs, whether those are pollinator gardens, whether it's replacing your entire front yard, maybe it's setting aside an area at your church or faith community or at a local school. But there's a lot that can be done through individual action to protect this kind of habitat. So I think, this is from my background of doing restoration in public lands, right? That I think it's really, really important that you sort of define what success is. And defining what success is going to differ a little bit site to site. So if you are taking a site that's been really beaten up, there are a lot of invasive weeds, you don't have a lot of budget, you don't have a lot of time, you don't have a lot of people, maybe it's just you. I think that setting a realistic goal about what it is, okay, I'm going to get these handful of robust native plants reestablished and growing is a really good goal, right? But saying that I'm going to recreate a pristine habitat, excuse me, excuse me, tree pollen's getting to me. Create a really pristine habitat that's all native things, and my timeline is 2 years. That is not a good way of defining success. Depending on the kind of work that you're doing and even just what your personal interests are as a land manager or as a gardener, you might want to define success as the presence of certain wildlife showing up. Maybe you really want swallowtails, maybe you want grass skippers. Maybe you are a large landowner and you want to see bobwhite quail come back, and you are able to commit 40 or 50 acres to some kind of grasslands establishment. Those are all valid, awesome goals to have. But really, what we want to see is, can these things perpetuate themselves? And we often, sometimes see, I don't want to call it a failure, but a state where a space can be very management intensive, where folks are seeding down every few years. I think that a good goal is to not have to be in that position where you're adding material in perpetuity to a site. And the other thing that you want to see is wildlife making use of it, and that's pollination, but really critically, it's also herbivory. We want those things, especially those insects that are looking for those host plants. A lot of those relationships are very, very specialized. And so it's always a good sign when you see native bugs, native wildlife coming and eating your plants, as long as they will survive. And like that photo of a swallowtail eating the zizzy at our nursery, that looks like a small plant. It can be eaten to the ground and it will regrow entirely. That is what co-evolved with it. It's used to being eaten by those bugs. So we really want to see that kind of ecological interaction. I apologize for the little slowdowns here waiting on the next slide. We're trying out a new system. Here we go. So there are a lot of different sort of tools that we can use to create really good quality habitat. And one of them is just to buffer out existing habitat. This is not a newfangled line of thinking, but I do mention this paper by Ellen Domshin that came out about 5 or 6 years ago now, because one, it's open access. So if you Google Domshin 2019 habitat connection, you can find the whole paper as a PDF. You can download it. You can read the whole thing. But her introduction, the abstract, and the discussion are phenomenal. It is really an impassioned plea that we need to be reconnecting habitat. There's a ton of good ecology that backs this up. And it also helps us target sites. So find places like this lawn outside the Fairfax County Government Center and try and convert that into better habitat. Anywhere where we can reduce stressors on existing sites by removing invasives, by removing bad land management, anything that's being mowed, especially by gas-powered mowers, even just the emissions from those small gas engines can be really harmful to a lot of our small wildlife, like our butterflies and things like that. You'll see them dead by the side of the road. Sometimes that is NOx poisoning. So anytime we can connect up habitat, even common habitat, that's really good. But connecting up rare plants is also a really important component of our landscape and allows those populations to get back in touch with each other, to be pollinated by each other. So, I always like to tell folks, start in an area where you can see success, where you can make a change, an area that's, maybe a little bit degraded. But if you can be adjacent or near to good quality habitat, that's a really, really good place to be. Hoping it, oh, there we go. So this is my own yard at home. There's my wife in the back and my daughter in the front. She's about 2.5 years old. And we don't have an HOA. Nobody's coming to bother us. So, we don't have a whole lot of design in our landscape. We have a whole lot of interesting plants. I haven't counted at last count, but I think we have over 100 species of things growing in our yards. Of course, we operate a native plant nursery, so it's easy for us to have a lot of diversity here. Your yard doesn't have to look like this. If you are more inclined to do formal gardening, you can do that with our native species. I think a lot of the design is in the layout, is in how you define borders and edges, is how you incorporate other elements. But the ecological value is in having the species there. And crucially, one of the big parts of ecological value is heterogeneity. So as you can make your yard different, especially as you're in a small pocket, if you can have open areas, even bare soil is an important component. So leave the leaves in some areas, leave the stems. But if you do have areas where not a lot is growing, it's too dry, it's too shady. We have areas of bare soil under some red cedars in another part of the yard. And we see ground nesting bees build their homes in there because they need that bare soil. So anything you can do to foster biodiversity, heterogeneity of habitat is a really important thing that you can be doing at home. And there's, again, a lot of good research that even small spaces, even in highly urbanized areas, is going to make a difference. Creating these refugia in rural areas in an agricultural context is also going to be very important, especially because a lot of our agricultural land doesn't directly support wildlife in the same way. So having these sort of pockets of meadows, that recreating those sort of pollinator garden sort of habitats is really important, regardless of what the surrounding landscape is. So when you're thinking about actual plant selection, I would really begin and start thinking about the most common species. And this is sometimes not where gardeners want to start, right? So we often think about, hey, what's the coolest thing? What's the rarest thing? Or I want something that's purple, or I only can tolerate things that are going to be like 2 feet in this area. All those design constraints can make it a little bit harder to get the basics of the ecology in. So having just a whole mix of just interesting but common things is really, really ecologically significant. And my next slide here will begin to go into why focusing on those common things is so crucial. Sorry, my magic shortcut thing. There we go. So this is a photo taken at Elk Lick Preserve. This is actually the largest publicly owned meadow in Fairfax County. It's about 40 acres, which means it's big. But even at 40 acres, there are some grassland nesting bird species that you would not expect to find nesting here because that's simply not enough habitat. So when, again, you're talking about the scale of restoration, it really matters. We'd have to more than double that to attract some of those other species. But it's big enough that bobwhite quail have come back in. And what's slightly out of focus in the foreground of this photo I took is state rare purple milkweed. And so that's immediately what your eyes drawn to. It's so cool to see these remnant populations. They pop up here and there, mostly in these wet meadows. In this case, we're at the edge of the forest here, kind of by a stream. But if you look at the surrounding area here, I'm hoping it'll jump to the next slide here. There we are. If you look at the surrounding area, what's actually making the habitat, what's allowing that rare purple milkweed to be there in this meadow or even kind of savanna sort of patch here is actually a whole lot of common species. And you see that over and over again in both our rare plant communities and in the sort of habitats where our rare plants live, that they're there because there are common species creating that habitat, making those areas, a sort of place where they can survive. So you don't want to begin with the rare species. You want to set the scene for that, and then you can always fill in those gaps. You don't need to know all of the species necessarily that I listed out here. Again, I will have a few slides about some common species and things I recommend. But when we're talking about in a broader picture of meadow restoration writ large, I really think that it's important to grapple with the site. And by site, I don't mean just like a region, but like specifically where do you want to plant? Manipulating or even just recognizing little niches and micro habitats and how you can go about going in there and really getting the right plant to the right place is really at the key of what we do for ecological restoration. And I think folks that are used to kind of gardening or master gardeners, master naturalists are used to thinking about the landscape in that way. So here are a few common plant species that, at least at the genus level, that I really recommend. These are very evidence supported things. So if you look at the research, if you want to support, as many pollinators as you can, especially specialist pollinators that aren't going to non-native plants, that if you don't have their host, they're not in the landscape. What the research finds is that most of our specialist pollinators are actually pollinators of common species. That kind of makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint, just in terms of if you're going to evolve to eat only one thing, it might be useful for that one thing to be common, so you can find it. That we certainly have specialist pollinators of rare specialist plants too. So things like our goldenrods, that is the genus Solidago or Euthymia, sunflowers, the genus Helianthus, our asters, primarily in the genus Symphiatricum. Silphiums are also, I think the common name most people would use for those is rosin weeds, are amongst the species that host the most number of specialist pollinator bees there. If you look at moths and butterflies, and that's what a lot of Doug Tallamy's research looks like, and Doug Tallamy makes a really good case for why thinking about moth and butterfly conservation is a good way of thinking about bird conservation, amphibian, reptile, small mammal conservation. In a meadow context, again, most of them are hosting on things like our asters, like our goldenrods, like our sunflowers. If you want to support, some of our specialist insect herbivores, like say, if you want to support monarchs, you will need milkweed, right? But migratory monarchs that are heading back south, usually they are nectaring on goldenrod. So if you are planting milkweed, it's a really, really good idea to also plant goldenrods because that is what's going to support those monarchs on their migration back south. I think I touched a little bit on this before. These are photos of two rare species that we've actually propagated in our nursery. That's my mom there holding a rare Solidago rigida stem. If you're from the Midwest listening to this, you might be surprised to learn that stiff goldenrod is rare in Virginia. We're at the very edge of its native range. So in Fairfax County, it's only known from two sites. We have reintroduced it to two others. But otherwise, it is very rare to see around here. I know that it's much more common in tall grass prairies and things out west. And then this is globally rare Pycnanthemum torii that we've grown and we've tried to reintroduce. We've had good success growing it, much more limited success getting it replanted out. We actually, listened to a presentation from some folks from Department of the Environment in New Jersey who were also working with the species, and they had a great deal of difficulty too. And one of the difficulties when you're working with a rare species is that it's really hard to get it out into the right places. Um, that stiff goldenrod patch there, that's actually sort of a moist patch. You can see the narrowleaf sunflower, which is a sunflower of wet meadows, growing right there in amongst it. But if you look up where Solidago rigida populations east of the Appalachians should be occurring, they're occurring on very dry meadows. So there's kind of that, there's a little bit of kind of guesswork even in figuring out, should we plant it at a site that is most similar to the remnant population site, or should we go with what the scientific papers say are good bets to where to place them? It's a hard question to know, and we want to make sure that we get those populations well established so they can continue in perpetuity. It's not necessarily doing the species or the ecology a lot of favor if these things just disappear into private gardens and collections. Those plants may sustain themselves in your garden, but they're unlikely to be part of a self-sustaining population, which is the end goal of the kind of restoration work that we want to see with rare species populations, rare species restorations, I should say. Excuse me. I will, because I'm trying to be cognizant of the time here, I'm going to skip this slide and come back to it because we do have a slide about cultivars here just coming up here. So when we're talking about cultivars, a cultivar it comes from the term cultivated variety of plants. And that is something where plant growers have traded these plants around. They've moved them, they've bred them selectively for certain traits, and then they've entered the trade. So a lot of times if you're going to Home Depot or whoever, a really big grower, you're going to get a cultivar. A lot of times if you're ordering seed, you're going to get a cultivar. That's just kind of the reality of where the nursery supply is. It's absolutely true that that's better than planting something invasive or something that's non-native entirely. But it's also true, and this is some evidence here. I don't want to get too far into it, but what this bar chart is showing is pollinator visitation comparing wild types to cultivars. And the vast majority of the cultivars planted out the same plot attracted a lot fewer pollinators, both native and non-native, compared to those wild types. In some cases, you can see there is parity. In some cases, you can see that the cultivars are outperformed. In some cases, there's really bad documentation about what the cultivars even are, like what species are they, and they get sold as the wrong thing. There was a lot of variegated Persicaria virginiana that got sold as native. And then subsequent work discovered, oh, it's actually a species from Japan and it's invasive. That was not the right thing. Those variegated ones were labeled as the wrong species, and that actually created an invasives problem. And everyone who was buying that thought they were getting, the right thing and doing the right thing by planting it back out. So it's a real example about how it can be difficult. So anytime you can source something straight species, you have an understanding of provenance. That I think really makes a difference at the end product, both in terms of the ecology and in terms of reducing harm. We talked a little bit about kind of working at low quality sites, and this site here, that's my mom and Susie, who Susie just retired this year, actually. And this was a meadow that got restored. And this was like literally a dirt pit before they dissed it and seed drilled it, and we did some planting. And it's a phenomenal kind of wet meadow with some really interesting little habitats and a lot of native plant cover, a lot of things. It wasn't useful for parking. Kids weren't playing ball on it. It was just there. So this is a really great example of reclaiming areas that don't serve a social function, that nobody's attached to, that are kind of eyesores, and turning them into something that's ecologically significant. I think that's a really easy win from a conservation standpoint. Sorry, can you jump me to the next slide here? I clicked my thing, but it's kind of, there we go. Um, Great. So we talked a little bit about some of the interactions with between wildlife and generalist sort of plants. These are a few of the things that we grow at our nursery. Again, I'm happy to share any of these slides or things, so don't furiously jot all these down. I want to just point out specifically getting some native grasses in there. So one really important component of getting grasses back into the landscape is that grasses are very deep rooted. They can really help over time loosen up highly compacted soils, especially a problem in post-agricultural sites and in urban suburban areas. Getting a mix of cool season and warm season grasses, that is, grasses that emerge and grow early on, like right now, or grasses that start putting on a lot of growth when it starts to get hot, is really important, especially to the resilience of the site, because a summer drought can affect things differently, or fall drought, than, say, a spring drought. If you have invasives like Japanese stilt grass, cool season grasses can be really useful to have because they can grow up and drop seed before the stilt grass starts to swamp out and take over the site. There are also wildlife that depends on this. So leaving your grasses up, that is, don't cut down your Indian grass and your broom sedge, first thing in the fall. Leaving that up is great habitat for birds. What we notice that even small meadows, if you delay mowing until, say, February or March, the amount and the diversity of small birds that are hanging out in those meadows, like overwintering goldfinches, overwintering bluebirds, juncos, a lot of our native sparrows, is so different versus when those areas get knocked back. So, having those things in there is really cool. There are moths and butterflies that do require them, that their life cycle requires them to eat the grasses. So they're a really, really important part. You don't have to do them as whole swaths, but I encourage people to maybe think about hitting a 40 or 50% grass to forbs, that is, to wildflowers, sort of mix on most meadow habitat. And you can intersperse that and then, have clumps of other things so it doesn't give the visual impression of being grass heavy, if that's what you prefer. I'm a real big believer. I know that I said at the very beginning that we should not have restoration projects, ideally, that require a ongoing level of planting, right? The idea is that at some point a site graduates out from that level of intensive management. Now, the reality is with any meadow, management absolutely has to be part of the equation, and I would make the case that management needs to be part of the equation in terms of our forests too, though that's a subject for a different talk. Taylor, I'd be happy to do that one too. But one of the things that we want to see is getting to a normal amount of management, maybe mowing once a year or every other year, or if you're in a position to do a controlled burn, doing a controlled burn once a year, every other year, but certainly not planting every year. But I will make a big case that planting should extend beyond a single season and beyond a single year. I think extending your idea of an initial plant out being like 2 to 3 years is really, really great. And the reason why is that it insulates you from what ecologists call year effects. So what happens there is, like, what if you planted a garden last spring and you weren't able to water it, we went into the summer that we had and then that really pernicious fall drought, you may have lost a lot of drought sensitive seedlings. Some of those plants, those species, if they had been mature, if they had been 2 or 3 years old, would have survived that and been able to keep perpetuating that population on site. But because we lost them all in that first year, what happens is there's no way for them to recolonize. So you have some sort of empty niche, you have less biodiversity on that site. And that can remain that way for years or decades. So with the goal of, a site being as diverse, as heterogeneous as possible, using appropriate native plants, we really want to extend that out. And again, I really encourage people too, is if you see, hey, I lost all of this one species, or, this didn't take, talking to folks who have done this, it doesn't have to necessarily be me, though we're always happy to talk plants. It can be chatting with other practitioners. It can be going on walks to other field sites, but understanding, hey, did something weird happen at my site, or was it the wrong plant for my spot? In some cases, it can be the right plant in the right place, but you got really unlucky with the timing, and it is absolutely worth trying again with that species to get it established. I'm also a big fan of getting actual plants in the ground. And again, I am biased because we don't sell seed. For us to sell seed, it really doesn't make sense because we're wild collecting. We don't want to collect more from the wild populations than we need to grow out things. We don't want to harm those populations by over collecting. But also, it's a real pain to clean and collect and get all that seed ready. But what a lot of research really suggests is that getting those seedlings back into the ground, instead of just using seed, really benefits the quality of the restoration overall. I think I have some charts for that on the next slide there. Thank you, Taylor. So again, this is kind of a dry slide. That's on me. But if you look at that little chart there, this is using an index of diversity. And what they're looking at is just how long since the planting. And the white circles are areas where they did potted plants, that is seedlings, as well as put down seed. And the black circles are the ones that they just did with seed. And then if you see the two triangles, the black triangle at the very last end represents a low quality sort of post-agricultural field. And the white triangle on the right side represents a high quality remnant prairie site. So like a wild site that hasn't been badly disturbed. And what you see is that there's a tendency for seedling only sites to be a little bit less diverse, but then also sort of peak a few years after seeding and drop back down. And this is absolutely something that we've seen practically in the field too, that a lot of those seeds don't bank. They sort of kind of go through a little wave of succession, but it's not as durable an intervention. Seeds are really, really good a few years out, but it seems that they don't stick around in the same way that getting those same plants in the ground as seedlings do. I don't fully understand the underlying reason why this is, but it's absolutely something that has been studied in a few papers, and it's something that we've seen on site. So planting out little pockets can be a really effective way. I believe my next site will talk a little bit about some of these things. So we mentioned the local ecotype things before. We don't need to delve into this whole paper. I add this chart here because this was research done on big bluestem, which is a dominant prairie grass out west. It's not really something we see as a major meadow constituent. In fact, I advise against planting it in meadows in Virginia. However, it's all over the place in the Midwest. It is wind pollinated. And a lot of the research or a lot of the assumptions were, oh, it's all homogenous, right? It's throwing pollen everywhere. It's all over the place. It can't be that diverse. And then when researchers actually looked at the genetics and they parsed them, what they found is that, oh, it's really diverse. It is not homogenous at all. In fact, those populations are very heterogeneous, even across one site. And again, I point to that because I think it's really important in terms of a plant sourcing, but also because that heterogeneity in the genetics is part of the resiliency package of getting those things back in. So even if you are in a situation where you don't have access to growers who are concerned about provenance, who are doing any kind of local ecotype propagation, you're not in a position to do any seed collection or propagation of your own. Sourcing from a variety of sources, getting a lot of different species, even if you just have to work with cultivars and you're getting different cultivars of the same species, all of that can foster that sort of resiliency on site, the same way that using potted plants in addition to seeds, can foster a lot of resiliency in your meadow planting. This is a fascinating point, but I think we'll skip it to make sure that we wrap up on time. So now if you're thinking about, okay, we want to do maybe some planting, I want to source broadly, I want to get, some diversity, but I want to make sure that we have our bases covered. There are probably a few different ways of tackling that, right? I'm a big fan of what we call applied nucleation. So what that means is that there are kind of two ways of doing it. You can leave a site alone. You could just throw down some seed. Those are very minimal interventions. Leaving a site alone is a totally valid way. Maybe you came in, you got rid of the invasives, and you wait a year. We do that all the time in our practice. And some cases you realize, oh, this is really good. I might plant a few things to fill in the gaps where I think a few crucial species are missing or there are some patches that aren't as good. But then you say it's perfect. It's time to walk away. But if you're working like the folks at Sustainability Matters have on creating a meadow on a capped landfill, you're going to have to do a lot of intensive work. And crucially, you're going to have to cover a lot of ground. And I think that's a really good case to make where you are going to do a seed only intervention because you are starting whole cloth and you have to do a lot of work. But if you're working integrated with a sort of established but maybe low quality sort of meadow, you may want to try out a technique we call applied nucleation. I'll explain a little bit about it on the next slide here. So in a sort of natural regeneration thing, you're not doing anything. There's no planting. And on the far right, we have a plantation style planting, where essentially you're planting, the entire thing more or less evenly throughout it. That's not to say that you can't have a high quality result by going through and planting out the entire space, having it all spaced out. You can still have a diverse result. You can still have different niches. But one thing that you will find on an applied nucleation result where you plant dense pockets, but maybe you're only covering 15, 20, 25% of the total restored area, is one, your cost will come down. That's true of forests, that's true of grasslands as well. You can pair it with other things, you can pair it with seed. The other thing that you will find is that you are inherently going to get more heterogeneity, especially in the structure of the site, that you may have more annuals in areas that were not heavily planted, more perennials in areas that were. That's going to be a difference in habitat for wildlife. You may have more bare soil in some areas. You may have just different age classes too. That's especially important in forested systems. I really like applied nucleation. We've played around with it. I think it's a great tool, and it's absolutely a tool that reduces costs for people. Regardless of how you're going to approach your restoration planting, I think it's really critical that you address these 5 key points, right? So any amount of time and money spent getting rid of the invasives before you tackle replanting is absolutely time and money well spent. Those can absolutely ruin a site rushing through that prep. You want to get that done. You want to do it right. Even in our meadows, thinking about deer exclusion or deer management, especially around a few sensitive species, is really important. It's less important than for our forested systems, but say if you have a wet meadow and you want to get Turk's cap lily back into it, you're going to need some kind of deer management, some kind of caging, or else you will not have them. Even like butterfly weed in some of our urban meadows, the deer eat the seed pods, and it is so frustrating to, one, if you're collecting the seed, but also to have that population self-sustain itself. You're going to want to keep an eye out for invasives. And as those incipient invasives get in, especially during the establishment phase, you're going to want to remove them, have some kind of plan for that, plan to be able to have that effort in there. And you want to get a phase in your planting. And especially if you're working at a new site, you really want to limit that soil disturbance, because of anything natives in there, whether that's a bud bank that is dormant plants, whether it's a native seed bank, that's going to be really, really important. So, unless you're working on the absolute most dire sites, soil scraping and things like that are generally really, really last ditch efforts for really badly degraded sites. I wouldn't recommend them for most folks as home gardens. And then just a reminder that, again, you can do nothing and just have institute good management practices and see good results. So, this is a meadow. It still has high quality fragments in it. It definitely has invasive problems. This is part of the Cub Run system in Fairfax. But the last few mows there, they can't burn there because they're high tension power lines, have gotten a little bit lower and have been a little bit more rough on the material there. They've gotten rid of a lot of brush, some of which is native, some of which isn't. But what that released was actually this phenomenal population of Asclepias tuberosa that was in what we call the bud bank. It was dormant, but it just didn't have the resources to come up because it wasn't exposed to enough light. It was getting shaded out. And then a few years after a big mow, it all comes out like that. There are a lot of our meadow species that respond that way. So, again, I think we hear a lot about leaving the leaves. That is still phenomenally good practice and evidence-based. But in a meadow system, you are going to need some disturbance to maintain a meadow. And some of that disturbance can be a little aggressive. You might want to mow a little bit lower. You might want to knock stuff back and actually rake some of the material out. A lot of the reason we burn is not just to get rid of top growth and shrubs, but it's actually burning off the material. It's burning off. You see a shift from lower total nitrogen, but more available nitrogen. You're altering carbon profiles in the soil. There's a lot of interesting practice to burn management, but at the home garden level, removing some of that material can be good, especially if you notice floppy plants. So if you plant, say, little blue stem or broom sedge, and they grow really big and then they start to flop over everywhere, that's a sign that your soils are very rich. Most of our high quality meadows actually have very nutrient poor soil, and they have a relatively low amount of organic material. So cutting some of that stuff back and composting it in your yard elsewhere can be really great over a few years to reduce the amount of organic material, reduce the amount of soil nitrogen over time, because we actually want that soil to be poor quality to have a high quality meadow, if that makes sense. We talked a little bit about ecotones before. I think that ecotone management, that getting those sort of edges established, is a really, really great way to find high quality or make high quality habitat, especially at home. This was a planting we did at Halloween, which is why members of my staff are dressed up like a hobbit or dwarf or something and a pumpkin. They can be really challenging too because you have a lot of invasive pressure. So it can take extra time to do that. What we see on the plant side for our ecotones, our forest to meadow edges, is not only are they diverse, but we have a whole lot of fecundity there too, that those plants are dropping a lot of seed and things like that. So that's a really nice component. We can go to the next slide there. And here is my daughter Maeve. This is taken about a year ago, but this is what like a forest edge could look like at home. Our backyard has a lot of tree cover. You saw our front yard, it's pretty sunny. But this sort of the very beginning of our backyard's kind of a mix, So we have native shrubs like the sambucus, the elderberry that's in bloom there. We have native Euonymus americanus. We have hazelnuts. We have viburnums. We have tulip trees. We have oaks and hickories in the backyard. But this area here too is also filled with jewelweed. We get a lot of hummingbirds that come to our backyard later on this season. So there's a lot you can play around with to create a lot of different kinds of habitat and ecotone and meadows for sure. And one thing I'd like to point out, this is a photo taken in the Rappahannock during the Civil War era, that, we have a lot of legacies of bad land use in here. And, this is unrecognizable, right? We have a lot more forested, a lot more high quality natural areas in areas that were just decimated, just all cut down and then all farmed or grazed. And I like to point this out because this is actually a turning point, In general, we have a lot better land management practices. We have more area in conservation than we did 150 years ago. So I think in a time when it's easy to feel pessimistic about a lot of different things, but certainly the environment is one of those things. I think it's important to remember that, we're actually working our way forward on a lot of environmental issues. We are making a lot of progress, and this kind of work is absolutely an area we can make a positive difference and begin to stave off extinction things. I think my last slide's coming up here. Um, so we can't spend too much time worrying about what bad things happened in the past in regards to environmental work. I think that, no matter kind of where you stand on things, being interested in conservation forces you to be a realist in certain ways, right? I would love if chestnut blight never got introduced in 1904 and we still had American chestnut trees here. But the reality is we really don't. So we have to make a decision. Are we using GMO? Are we using back crosses? Are we not reintroducing at all? But those are all kind of reality-based things. So really encourage folks, get back out there, get in the wild, play around with things. And really crucially, when you're managing your own projects or doing things, I think it's really important to get out there and make mistakes. I think that is part of learning. It's part of rebuilding our connection with our natural areas, with our plants, and with our wildlife. And it's part of developing your own expertise. So don't be paralyzed by trying to do the absolute most perfect thing. I've been doing this full time since 2011, and there is scarcely a project that I've been involved in where I don't look back at it and think, oh, I could probably do that better now. But I like to spin that in a positive way. It's how my practice has evolved, rather than I was an idiot in the past, right? Though I guess technically both are true. Okay, thank you for bearing with me. I know that I think I cruised a little bit over. We are obviously I'm happy to take questions, and there's some contact information about how you can get involved. Please do check out our compendium if you found any of this interesting. We have a lot of plant information on that, and we're always happy to share.
Thank you so much, Maddie. That was so informative. Somebody pointed out that every time they hear you speak, they learn something new, and I think that is so very true. Just so much knowledge and so much hope. I think that's one thing that I get out of this too is we can do a lot, even just in a small space. So thank you so very much. We will share these slides. So if you want to look at some of the research that Maddie shared, or any of these papers or links, we will send that out in our follow-up email. Okay, let's see, just a couple more things. We are gonna stay on a little bit after 8 because we did have a couple questions that we want to get to. We are recording, so if you do need to hop off, totally understand. But you will receive the full recording. So please go ahead if you have any questions, pop those in the Q&A, and we'll get those teed up for just a minute. Just really briefly, if you want to get started on your native plant journey, these are some great resources. At least in Virginia, we have the Plant Virginia Natives. They actually have regional guides that are really focused on the different regions throughout Virginia. So please check those out. They're wonderful. You can even get a personal an actual book, or you can download the PDF online. Those are great resources, a way to get started. And then if you are more techie, just a couple apps that can help you either identify invasive species, flora, fauna, whatever you need. Picture This and iNaturalist are great places to start. And if you want to dive in a little bit deeper, the Flora Virginia app, they actually have an online browser version as well, is a great place to really dive in a bit deeper if you want to learn some more. And we'll send all of these in the links later. I just wanted to highlight a couple of our programs that we use and that we plant native meadows with. Maddie actually mentioned one of these. That's our Making Trash Bloom program. And this was kind of our flagship, really our first step into native meadows. And this was working with closed landfills and using this space that can't really be utilized for a lot of things, to, instead of planting invasive grass species, we can put in native habitat and plant some pollinator meadows. And so now we have 3 active meadows and growing to hopefully a few more meadows growing for the future. So if you have any landfill connections, we would love to hear from you, as we're always looking for future partners. One of our more recent meadows, we have a wonderful relationship with Winchester, with Jim Barnett Park. And we planted a meadow there last April. And so we had a joyous seeding party there. We did hand seeding, and we're actually going to have a celebration on April 26th, celebrating our year kind of anniversary of our planting from last year. So we would love to see you on April 26th. And if you're not on our newsletter, we actually just sent out the save the date for that. But feel free to check out our events page on our website. We would love to have you there. And then our most recent meadow was actually at the W&OD Trail as a part of our Making History Bloom project. And we actually just recently seeded a meadow in Vienna at the Love Sign. We're calling it our Love Meadow. And we kind of planted it around Valentine's Day. So it was all about the love of pollinators and native plants. And we had a great time planting that meadow. And we can't wait to see what happens and watch what grows. And if you would like to be a part of the volunteer team that keeps an eye on this meadow, we would love the help on that one. Okay. So there's many different ways that you can get involved. I know things are starting to bloom right now. If you would like to get some native plants, please check out our Sangha. They have so many different plants. It's like heaven going there. It is just phenomenal being at Earth Sangha. So please go check out any of your local nurseries. We'll actually send out a link where you can find out some local nurseries throughout Virginia. And then as well, we would love to get some volunteers. We have a couple of different events coming up. So please check out our volunteer page where you can find out about future opportunities to help out. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop into some questions that we have for Maddie. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Let me start at the beginning. So, Maddie, would you have any advice or maybe point people in a direction for if they would like to plant in public spaces? So maybe talking with their HOAs or maybe some advice on how to get native meadows in more public spaces.
Sure. So I think one thing is having some kind of sense of a design that you want. I think that in a lot of areas where you're tackling doing a sort of pollinator garden or meadow install on public lands, also recognizing that that is going to be a very intensive sort of rewilding versus, say, putting in some trees or something. So realizing what you're getting yourself into, and I think having a sort of clear idea of what a meadow being established looks like, because it does not look like, say, Taylor's wonderful background screen year one, so it takes a little while to get there. I think having a little bit of design, and I think too is that getting that community buy-in for those spaces are so key, because it's so easy for folks to revert and just say, it's too complicated, let's just mow it, right? So choose some plant species that are popular with people that, read like a garden. I talk about, say, why like bone sets are really important ecologically, but that may not be where I begin with that kind of project, because bone sets just read kind of weedy to people. Even goldenrods, they're important. They're not that exciting, so don't lean heavy on them for that kind of space. What's going to be most important to the resiliency of that kind of habitat is that there is public acceptance of it. So going in and saying, I'm going to get Rudbeckias and Monardas and mountain mints, things that immediately read to people as, hey, this is intentional, this is meant to be. Also the other thing that I find just from a design standpoint, I'm not a designer, but what people seem to respond well to are like borders and stuff, right? So like take the time to edge in a nice edge to your garden, maybe have it have a cool shape, maybe add some stepping stones through it. Those are little steps that you can take that make it read a lot more intentional, I think build up a lot more goodwill.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm gonna hop onto a couple more. There were a couple questions that were species specific. I will probably point those to you maybe afterwards, and so we can follow up those people.
Sure.
But we did have a couple general questions. So you did mention about 40 to 50% of the meadow should be forbs. And so someone asked what the diversity in that should be. So like how many different species should you aim for? If there's any advice.
Um, So I think if you look at some of the research about what like really, really high quality, well-established sort of Piedmont prairies look like, they're finding upwards of 100 species on some of these sites. So you can accommodate a very high degree of biodiversity over time if that's what you want to do. I think that in terms of like an initial go around, if you're in the realm of, 7 to 20-ish species, that's a really solid number to be at. To give you a sense about this, we recently did some bulk seed collecting out on some good quality but not pristine restored sites to support reseeding on those sites. So we just gave the seed back to the park authority after we cleaned it. And we identified about 25 to 30-ish species on these reasonably well-established sites that had, wild pockets, but also pockets that were restored. So, if you're getting to a sustained kind of 20 or 30 species, I think that's phenomenal.
That's great advice. Um, somebody else asked if you could suggest how can you incorporate maybe if you live in an HOA or you live in a neighborhood, maybe you have dogs and kids and maybe need a little bit of turf area. How maybe what are some natives to start with, or what can you incorporate safely?
Sure. So I would say one thing is that, there's a lot that you can just stop doing to your lawn to make it better. So stop having pesticides sprayed anywhere on your property, even those things advertised as pollinator safe, or sometimes they're advertised as organic. They're going to be killing pretty much any arthropod they come in contact with because they're spraying things like pyrethroids around. So you don't want to do any of that. Stop fertilizing your lawn. The phosphorus especially that runs off is leading to algal blooms. And as you stop doing that, your lawn will develop little patches, and like putting in, say, native violets like Viola sororia, can be really, really great. Putting in pockets of, say, pathrush, Juncus tenuis in there. In those cases where you have low quality turf that's failing, you don't necessarily need to get rid of it if the goal is to still mow it and have it be walkable or for kids to play or for dogs to run on. But you can incorporate other very, very low growing species in there. I'm not a big believer in sedge lawns, and I know that there are probably people on here who have had sedge lawns installed and love them. My take is generally one is that you can't really walk on a sedge lawn in the same way. But two is that if you're taking a non-native monoculture and you're putting in a lot of work to remove a non-native monoculture, and then you're turning around and putting in a native monoculture in that is just one species, you're missing a big opportunity to add a lot of diversity in. So if you want something very low growing that's native, things like pathrush, things like low growing sedges, and choose some different ones, maybe Carex blanda, maybe Carex glaucodia, in more moist spots, maybe you're looking at James sedge or something. You could be looking at Luzula species too, and then maybe creeping native things like our native strawberry can kind of creep in between, our native potentillas, Antenaria in dry areas. There are a lot of very low growing options that grow in those spaces.
Wonderful. So we have time for one last question. I think this is a great one to wrap up on. So when it comes to more like community science or finding out about programs, maybe how can people learn more about the impact on organisms through bioblitzes? Or do you know any iNaturalist groups that they could join where they could learn more about? I think this is in reference to maybe the pollinators.
I would say that getting involved in like the two groups that have helped me the most and that we see a lot of folks kind of going through these programs, and I think getting a lot out of are, get involved, especially if you're in Virginia with the Virginia Native Plant Society, or if you're elsewhere, whatever your local Native Plant Society is. Getting involved in a Master Naturalist chapter, I think too, it gets you in touch with other people. At our local chapter, the Virginia Native Plant Society, there is a core of them that they call themselves the grass bunch, and they just go around to meadows. They ID grasses, they ID sedges, and they spend a lot of time on the ground. And what's great about this kind of community, and I think this is true from professional ecologists and botanists all the way down to sort of interested amateurs going around and doing this in their spare time and just getting started, is there is nobody here who doesn't take the time to explain and teach new things. I wouldn't be where I am today professionally and, with my own love of plants if it weren't for all the ecologists and botanists that over the years were willing to teach me these things. So there's just such a phenomenal community of people here who are willing to go out and do those hikes. But Master Naturalists and the Virginia Native Plant Society are really, really great ways to get involved with those groups and meet those people.
That's wonderful. I know on iNaturalist, you can even go and search for groups that are in your area, and sometimes they'll showcase bioblitzes and things. So there's so many different ways you can get involved, whether it's on the tech side or with a learning group, or even local parks. I know a lot of times they have the groups that do educational talks and walks. So thank you.
And if you're in Fairfax, come. We have volunteer days Sunday, Monday, and Wednesday at our nursery. We spend a lot of time chatting about plants. I'm giving a lot of talks. I have 6 more in the next 6 weeks. So, uh,
Well, thank you for sharing your knowledge.
my pleasure.
We, it's infectious. So we all are so grateful to learn from you. And definitely check out those days. I think you can find those on the Earth Sangha website.
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think that's about as much time as we have. There was, I think, 2 more questions, but we'll make sure that we follow up with some information in the resources about those two, or at least where you can find out more about those 2 specific species. Okay, just a few things that we have coming up. April is Earth Month, and it is going to be a busy one. We have so many different things going on. I'm sure Earth Sangha has quite a few work days and events coming up. And so we will be all over the place throughout the Shenandoah and the Piedmont and all throughout Northern Virginia at many different events celebrating Earth Month. And so the closest one we have coming up is actually will be the Alexandria Sustainability Festival. So on April 5th, please come join us. There will be a dog walk and all things sustainability. So we're really excited to be featured there. And then as well, our big celebration in Winchester. Come help us celebrate. We'll have some cupcakes sponsored by a local cupcake company. So come get a cupcake and share some information about butterflies and have a good spring day and celebrate Earth Month with us. And we do need some volunteers to help us table. So if you want to help us celebrate Earth Month, we would love to have you share your knowledge and your excitability about the environment with others. So we'd love to have you there. We couldn't do any of this without the support of many of our grant funders. So we just always want to shout out our wonderful supporters, and hopefully maybe some of you all can be them one day as well. So we'd love to have you join us. If you want to learn more, please feel free to email us if you have any other further questions. We'd love to have you become a member with us. You can get access to many more resources, and as well join us for special events, and as well please, we'd love to get donations. That helps us. That's one of the few ways that we can keep doing really free events like this, and events like we do in Winchester and a lot of our seating parties. So every little bit helps. And just thank you all so very much for being with us today. And the biggest thank you ever to Maddie and Earth Sangha for your expertise and your time and just sharing all of your knowledge with us. It means the world to not only us at Sustainability Matters, but all of our participants who gained so much from your wealth of knowledge today. So thank you so very much. And thank you all. We will send out resources and the video link hopefully tomorrow. If not, the next couple of days, you will get the link to the recording and all of the resources that we shared today. So thank you all so very much, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. And we hope to see you on our next Meadows in the Making webinar. Thanks so much, everyone.